So welcome to a conversation with Michelle Grattan on our week in politics. My name's Paddy Nixon. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Hi, Paddy. It's been a big week.
So this week has been a big week, and of course we've had that phenomenal outbreak in Victoria, looking at a 6-week lockdown. And as we're reflecting on that and considering it, so who's responsible for this? Has there been mismanagement, and how bad can it be?
Well, there has been some mismanagement. The quarantine arrangements in Victoria were badly carried out. The government decided to use private security firms instead of using police or even the military, and that led to all sorts of breakdowns and transmission to some of the security guards, and they of course passed it on to family members, and the whole thing ended in disaster. There were also other outbreaks too which have contributed to the Victorian situation, so we've seen a big spike in cases there, and it'll be some time before we know whether the whole Victorian outbreak can be got under reasonable control, and even more important, whether it will spread to other states. Other states have been quick to act. There's of course a hard border now between Victoria and New South Wales. They didn't shut down the border during the earlier part of the crisis, so it shows how seriously it's now being taken, and other states which have been opening and are opening their borders are saying, if you're from Victoria, don't come.
And it's very interesting, I think, that in the face of all of that, Scott Morrison has been very restrained. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think because he wants to keep the National Cabinet, which is of course federal and state government leaders, functioning effectively. He knows that if he lashes out at Victoria, and I'm sure he really feels like doing so, that will be counterproductive. Now, some of the cynics might say, well, the federal government was willing to be critical of Queensland for not opening its borders, and incidentally Queensland's opening those borders today, except for Victorians, but noting that there is a state election looming there, and so there's a bit of politicking involved. But basically, I think Scott Morrison just thinks it's better to keep everyone on an even keel, at least in political terms, in terms of blame games, as much as possible.
And you mentioned National Cabinet there, and obviously National Cabinet will be discussing today, I think, the slowing down the flow of international visitors and flights. What's behind all that? Why has this suddenly come to light at the moment?
Well, the Victorian situation has been a sort of trigger point, because after the quarantine debacle, Victoria said, well, we can't take any more returning Australians into quarantine, and so those flights have had to be diverted, and other states have said, well, the burden of quarantine is really getting too much, too expensive, so now they're going to, I think, charge people. Already people are being charged by the Queensland government, but charge incoming travellers to other places for their quarantine costs in all those hotels, but also National Cabinet will put some sort of cap on the overall numbers, so it just slows the intake of people. Of course, the government can't stop Australians returning, but it can put some sort of constraint on how fast they do return. And also I think there's a bit of a lack of sympathy by governments towards these people. There's a feeling, well, it's been quite a long time since the border was closed, since the warnings were sent out, and you really should have returned by now.
And then I've been watching this one very particularly this week, the sort of evolving international politics and relationships with China, and particularly Scott Morrison's approach to Hong Kong and the changing of the rules there. Is this a real change in Australia-China's relationships? And particularly, I think China has said this is a gross interference in the affairs.
What the government is doing is really extending the visas for people from Hong Kong who are here and providing a more generous deal, providing a pathway to residency after a longer visa period is allowed, and it's also attracting or trying to attract businesses from Hong Kong. The Chinese reaction is predictable, and in terms of worsening relations, well, it's really just another thing. The relationship is now very bad between the two countries, and I think that anything that the Australian government does, the Chinese are likely to react negatively to. The other thing that the government has announced this week, apart from the more generous visa circumstances, is that we're suspending the extradition treaty which we have with Hong Kong, which is of course, all of this is in the wake of the tough new security laws.
One of the things I was hearing only just this morning is that those laws are not just applying in Hong Kong, but actually internationally. So anyone here that might speak out and then travel to Hong Kong is actually, those laws apply to them. So.
Yes, well, that's right. And it just shows how draconian the new provisions are.
And then just moving on to the election last weekend.
Which we now can hardly remember.
We can now hardly remember. The world's moved on at such a pace, but Kristy McBain, the Labour candidate, has won Eden-Monaro. What are we going to take from that?
I think what we take is that Anthony Albanese dodged a bullet here. There's only a few hundred votes in that election, and it easily really could have gone the other way. We're talking about less than 1,000 votes. The votes aren't all counted yet because the postals dribble in over a couple of weeks. But anyway, Labor did win. If Albanese had lost this by-election, I think it would have been very bad. The Liberals have been spinning this very hard, saying, well, the Labor vote went down, and that's, of course, unusual for a by-election result, and therefore they're trying to claim something out of it. I think in the circumstances, a win is a win is a win, and I don't think, especially in the sort of overall situation we find ourselves in the pandemic, that people are going to be obsessing over the details of that win. I think that a year from now we'll have this by-election even deeper in the recesses of our political minds.
Well, as always, that's been fascinating, Michelle. I don't expect next week is going to be any quieter, so I look forward to chatting to you next Friday and reflecting on the week in politics. Thank you very much.
See you then.